The kitchen clock reads 12:17 when I realize Julian isn't coming tonight. The numbers glow green against the darkness, each minute that passes feeling heavier than the last. I've been sitting here for nearly an hour, nursing the same glass of whiskey, watching the front door like it might suddenly explain itself. The door stands slightly ajar. I left it that way at 7:12, the exact time Julian usually arrives. 7:12 has become sacred in this house, marked by the soft knock that never varies, followed by the familiar sound of work boots being kicked off in the hallway. Tonight, there was no knock. Tonight, the silence stretched on until it became something I could no longer ignore. Summer rain falls steadily against the windows, each drop catching the yellow light from the street lamp outside. The air that drifts through the open door carries the smell of wet asphalt and something sweeter, night-blooming jasmine from Mrs. Chen's garden next door. I should close the door. The rain is starting to blow in, dampening the hardwood floors that Diane once polished religiously every Sunday morning. But I don't move. Some part of me believes that keeping it open means he might still come. Across from me, Julian's chair sits pulled out just a little too far from the table. It's been that way for weeks now, positioned at the exact angle he prefers, close enough to reach for the salt without asking, far enough back that he can stretch his long legs underneath. His denim jacket hangs over the back of it, the fabric soft with wear and faded in places where his shoulders have rubbed against truck seats and toolbox edges. The jacket has spent more nights in my house this month than in his own closet. I know this with the kind of certainty that comes from paying attention to small things, from memorizing the details of someone else's life without meaning to. The left pocket has a small tear near the seam where he caught it on a carburetor last spring. The right sleeve bears a permanent grease stain that Vanessa complained about once, though Julian just shrugged and said it gave the jacket character. I reach for my phone, my fingers hovering over his name and my contacts. The last message between us was from this morning, him saying he might be late tonight because of a transmission that was giving him trouble. I typed back that dinner would keep, that I'd wait. The words sit there now, like a promise I'm not sure how to interpret. Thunder mutters somewhere in the distance, still miles away, but getting closer. The storm that's been threatening all day is finally moving in, bringing with it the kind of heavy darkness that makes the house feel smaller than it really is. I set the phone back down without calling. There are things you can ask and things you can't, invisible lines that friendship draws around itself for protection. Tonight feels like one of those nights when crossing those lines might break something neither of us is ready to lose. Instead, I stand and walk to Julian's chair. The jacket feels heavier than it should when I lift it, the denim cool against my palms. I fold it carefully, matching the sleeves exactly the way I've watched him do a dozen times. The gesture feels oddly intimate, like handling something sacred, like keeping a piece of someone safe when they can't do it themselves. I carry it to the living room and drape it over the back of the couch, smoothing out the wrinkles with more attention than the task requires. From here, I can see the kitchen table through the doorway, can see the empty chair that has become such a fixture in my evenings that its absence feels like missing a limb. The rain grows heavier, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. I've always loved storms, the way they give permission for solitude, the way they make staying inside feel necessary rather than chosen. Tonight, though, the sound feels different. Tonight, it sounds like loneliness amplified. I return to my chair at the kitchen table, but I don't sit. Instead, I stand with my hands pressed against the back of it, looking at the space where Julian should be. This is the chair where I've sat for 10 years, through the slow dissolution of my marriage, through the long months of learning how to live alone again. It faces the window that looks out onto the street, the same window where I first noticed Julian's truck appearing more and more frequently in my driveway. The whiskey has gone warm in my glass, amber liquid reflecting the overhead light like captured fire. I don't remember the last time I drank alone before Julian started coming here. Before, there was always some reason to finish the bottle, a celebration, a commiseration, an excuse to call it medicine for wounds I couldn't name. Now the glass sits untouched because drinking alone feels like admitting something I'm not ready to admit. The clock ticks past 12:25, each second measured and precise. Time has become elastic in this house, stretching during the hours when Julian is here, compressing into nothing during the long stretches when he's not. I've started measuring my days differently, not by sunrise and sunset, but by the sound of his truck in the driveway, by the rhythm of conversations that flow like water, finding its level. I think about the way he looked this morning when he left for work, the way he paused at the front door with his hand on the knob. There was something in his expression I couldn't read, something that made him seem further away than usual despite standing just inches from where I'm sitting now. He said he'd see me tonight, the same thing he said every morning for weeks, but something in his voice sounded different. Final, maybe, or careful in a way that suggested he was already practicing goodbye. The storm is closer now, lightning illuminating the kitchen in brief, stark flashes. In those moments of harsh light, everything looks different. The familiar furniture strange and angular, the shadows deeper and more defined. I find myself counting the seconds between lightning and thunder, a childhood habit that measures distance and heartbeats. 3 seconds. The storm is less than a mile away now, moving fast across the valley. By morning, it will have passed through completely, leaving behind only the smell of rain-washed air and the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything look sharper than it really is. But right now, in this moment suspended between one day and the next, I sit in my kitchen and wait for a man who may never knock on my door again. The empty chair holds its vigil across from me, patient and unmovable. Julian's absence fills the space around it like a presence of its own, demanding attention in the way that missing things do. I close my eyes and listen to the rain, to the tick of the clock, to the sound of my own breathing in a house that has grown too used to holding more than one person's solitude. When I open them again, it's 12:34, and Julian still isn't coming home. I am 42 years old, and I have lived in this house for exactly 10 years and 4 months. I know this because I bought it 3 weeks after my 40th birthday, when Diane and I still believed that new walls could somehow contain the slow leak our marriage had become. The bungalow sits on Maple Street, unremarkable in every way except for the ancient oak tree in the front yard that drops its leaves like clockwork every October, covering the walkway in a carpet of gold that I never quite managed to rake fast enough. The house is modest, practical in the way that architectural drafters learned to appreciate. 1,500 square feet of post-war construction, updated with reluctant efficiency over the decades by owners who understood necessity better than beauty. The kitchen faces east, catching morning light through windows that Diane once hung with yellow curtains. I took them down after she moved out, but the brackets remain, casting small shadows on the sill where her African violets used to bloom. My days follow a pattern that has crystallized over the 2 years since the separation papers were first drawn up, though they still sit unsigned in the second drawer of my desk, buried beneath utility bills and warranty information for appliances I no longer remember purchasing. Coffee at 6:15, black and bitter in a mug that reads World's Greatest Dad, a gift from Diane's sister that somehow survived the careful division of our possessions. The bus to downtown arrives at 7:38, carrying me through neighborhoods that wake up slowly, past houses where other people's lives unfold behind lit windows. The drafting office occupies the 3rd floor of a building that was modern once, sometime in the 1970s. My desk sits beneath fluorescent lights that hum with the persistence of insects, surrounded by the tools of precise measurement and careful planning. I spend my hours bent over blueprints for buildings I will never see completed, translating architects' dreams into the language of contractors and city planners. There is satisfaction in the work, in the way straight lines can impose order on chaos, in the mathematics of load-bearing walls and foundation depths. But it is in the evenings, in the bus ride home through streets that grow familiar again, that my life intersects with Julian Ward's in ways that neither of us planned. Julian is 38, for years younger than me, but weathered in places where I remain smooth. His hands tell stories in grease stains and small scars, the kind of hands that know engines the way I know blueprints. He works at Henderson's Auto Repair on the South Side. in a garage that smells permanently of motor oil and the industrial coffee that mechanics brew strong enough to wake the dead. He has been married to Vanessa for 12 years, long enough for the sharp edges of romance to wear down into something more complicated, something that requires careful navigation. They have a daughter, Emma, who is 9 years old and inherits her father's easy laugh along with her mother's careful eyes. Julian speaks of her with the kind of tenderness that suggests love complicated by distance, by work schedules that keep him away, too many evenings and weekends that disappear beneath the demands of other people's broken transmissions. I have been to their house exactly once, 18 months ago, for a barbecue that Vanessa organized with the determined cheerfulness of someone trying to prove something to herself. The house sits across town in a development that was built during the boom years, when families still believed in backyards and two-car garages. It is larger than mine, filled with the accumulated debris of a life shared between three people who are still learning how to occupy the same space without stepping on each other's dreams. That afternoon, I watched Julian move through his own home like a visitor, careful not to disturb the arrangements of throw pillows and framed photographs that Vanessa had positioned with the precision of a museum curator. He grilled hamburgers on a deck that overlooked a lawn cut to suburban perfection, and when Emma asked him to push her on the swing set, he glanced first at his wife, as if requesting permission to be a father in his own backyard. Our friendship began 10 years ago in the parking lot of Miller's Grocery, where my aging Honda had chosen to die on a Thursday evening in October. Julian emerged from his truck like a mechanic from central casting, all flannel shirt and easy confidence, asking if I needed help with the kind of sincerity that city living had taught me not to trust. But his hands knew my engine better than I knew my own marriage, and within 20 minutes he had me running again, refusing payment with a grin that suggested he fixed broken things as naturally as other people breathed. What started as occasional beers at Murphy's Pub became something more necessary after Diane moved out. Julian's presence filled the hollow spaces in my house in ways I didn't understand at first, his laughter echoing off walls that had grown too accustomed to silence. He would arrive after work, still carrying the smell of motor oil and honest labor, and somehow make my kitchen feel like a place where conversations could happen instead of just a room where I ate dinner alone. The neighborhood around us settles into evening quiet with the predictability of a music box winding down. Mrs. Chun tends her jasmine garden with the devotion of a monk. The Kelly's dog barks at precisely 4:30 every afternoon, marking time like a furry metronome. Children ride bicycles on sidewalks that crack a little more each winter, their voices fading as streetlights flicker to life under a sky that deepens from blue to black with the patience of something that is nowhere else to be. This is the world I inhabit, measured and contained, bordered by bus schedules and deadlines, and the careful distance I maintain between what I want and what I allow myself to have. Until Julian started staying later, until his truck became a fixture in my driveway, until the sound of his key in my lock became as familiar as my own heartbeat. The shift began on a Tuesday evening in late September, when the air carried the first real promise of autumn and the light through my kitchen window had started to slant in a way that made everything look temporary. Julian arrived later than usual that night, after 8 o'clock, moving with the slow precision of someone who had wrestled with particularly stubborn machinery all day. The smell of engine grease clung to him more heavily than normal, mixed with something else I couldn't identify at first, a faint trace of cologne that seemed out of place on a man who usually smelled only of honest work and Irish spring soap. He settled into his chair with a heaviness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, accepting the beer I offered without his usual ritual of pretending he shouldn't stay long. We ate leftover meatloaf in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that had developed between us over months of shared meals. But tonight it felt different somehow. Waited, as if both of us were carrying conversations we couldn't quite bring ourselves to start. It wasn't until he was helping me clear the dishes, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms mapped with small scars and faded tattoos, that he mentioned Vanessa almost casually, the way you might comment on the weather. She had taken Emma to her mother's place in Sacramento for the week, he said, rinsing a plate underwater that ran too hot. Something about school clothes and quality time with grandparents, though the way he said it suggested there were other reasons he either didn't know or didn't want to examine too closely. The house feels strange when it's empty, he continued, setting the clean plate in the dish rack with unnecessary care. All those rooms and no one to fill them. Makes a man notice things he usually doesn't have time to see. I asked what kind of things, though some part of me already knew the answer would be something I wasn't prepared to hear. How quiet his own footsteps sound on hardwood floors. How the television talks to itself in an empty living room. How a house can hold the absence of people just as powerfully as it holds their presence. I offered the guest room without thinking, the words emerging from some deeper place than conscious decision. It's just sitting there empty anyway, I said, as if the room hadn't been empty for the entire 2 years since Diane moved out, as if I regularly hosted visitors who required fresh sheets and clean towels. You don't need to rattle around in that big house by yourself. Julian looked at me for a long moment, his hands still wet from dishwater, and something passed between us that felt like recognition. Not of attraction or desire. Not yet, but of mutual loneliness, of two men who had grown weary of occupying space alone. He said he might take me up on that, just for a night or two, just until Vanessa and Emma came home. The words carried the careful casualness of someone testing the weight of a possibility. That night, after he brought in a small duffel bag from his truck, I showed him to the guest room that had served mainly as storage since Diane left. The bed was still made with sheets that smelled of lavender fabric softener and disuse. I apologized for the dust, for the stack of architectural journals on the nightstand, for the way the overhead light cast harsh shadows that made the room feel smaller than it was. Julian assured me it was perfect, better than perfect, running his hand along the quilt that Diane's mother had sewn for us as a wedding gift. The gesture was so gentle, so appreciative of something I'd almost forgotten I owned, that I felt an unexpected tightness in my chest. The next morning, I woke to the sound of coffee being made in my own kitchen, to the soft murmur of Julian's voice as he talked on his phone with someone who might have been Vanessa or might have been his supervisor at the garage. The domestic familiarity of it caught me off guard. Not unpleasant, but startling in the way that unexpected gifts can be. We developed a rhythm over the next few days that felt as natural as breathing. Julian would shower first while I made breakfast, the sound of water running in pipes that had grown accustomed to serving only one person. We would eat together at the kitchen table, sharing sections of the newspaper and comfortable observations about the weather, about work, about nothing in particular. In the evenings, after dinner, we would find ourselves in the living room. Julian stretched out on the couch while I occupied my usual chair, watching television programs neither of us particularly cared about, but both of us seemed reluctant to turn off. The space between us felt charged with possibility, though neither of us acknowledged what kind of possibility that might be. On Wednesday, Julian mentioned casually that he might stay until Vanessa returned, that it seemed silly to go back to an empty house just to leave again the next evening. I agreed, perhaps too quickly, that it made perfect sense. Practical even. Why waste gas driving back and forth across town? By Friday, there had been no mention of going home, no phone calls to discuss return dates or weekend plans. Julian's shaving kit appeared on the bathroom counter next to mine. His baseball cap found a permanent place on the hall table, right beside my keys and wallet. Small invasions that felt less like intrusions and more like completions, as if my house had been waiting for someone to claim its empty spaces. Friday night, we sat in darkness after I turned off the living room lamp, neither of us making the move to end the day. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant whisper of traffic on streets where other people were going home to their own lives. But we were already home, Julian and I, sitting in the dark together, and something was shifting between us like a tide, turning miles offshore, powerful and inevitable and still too far away to name. October arrived with the kind of crisp mornings that make you believe in fresh starts, and Julian's temporary stay began to feel less temporary with each day that passed without mention of leaving. What had started as a favor between friends transformed into something that neither of us named, but both of us seemed to understand. A domestic arrangement that filled the spaces in both our lives we hadn't realized were empty. The mornings took on a ritual quality that surprised me with its comfort. I would wake to the sound of Julian moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft clink of ceramic against counter as he prepared coffee for both of us. By the time I emerged from my bedroom, there would be 2 mugs waiting, mine filled black, his lightened with cream and sugar in proportions I had memorized without conscious effort. We would stand at the kitchen counter together, him scrolling through messages on his phone while I read the news on my tablet, sharing the kind of comfortable silence that married couples achieve after years of practice. Julian had a way of inhabiting space that made everything feel more lived in. His work boots by the front door kicked off at angles that suggested someone who came home rather than just visited. His coffee cup, left on the counter with rings of residue that I found myself reluctant to wash away immediately. The bathroom mirror, now fogged each morning by 2 showers instead of 1, holding the ghost of his presence even after he had gone to work. In the evenings, after we had both returned from our separate days, we would reconvene in ways that felt choreographed by some invisible director. Julian would arrive first, letting himself in with the spare key I had given him without ceremony, already moving through the house like someone who belonged there. I would find him in the kitchen, sometimes starting dinner, sometimes just leaning against the counter with a beer, waiting for me to come home to a house that had learned to hold 2 people's solitude. We talked about music during those dinner hours, Julian introducing me to country singers I had dismissed too quickly, while I shared classical compositions that he listened to with the kind of attention I had forgotten anyone could give to the things I cared about. We discussed cars, though my knowledge was theoretical where his was intimate. We spoke about the city we had both grown up in, the way it had changed around us while we weren't paying attention, becoming somewhere neither of us quite recognized anymore. Some evenings we watched films, quietly selected from streaming services, negotiations conducted in glances and subtle suggestions rather than direct requests. Julian never complained about the foreign movies I favored, the slow-paced dramas that Diane had always found boring. He would stretch out on the couch, his long legs extended, his attention focused on subtitles with the patience of someone who had learned that good things often required effort to understand. I began to notice things about him that I had never observed during our brief pub meetings or weekend visits. The way he leaned against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, his weight shifted onto one hip in a pose that suggested someone comfortable in his own skin. The slight rasp in his voice when he was tired, a roughness that made his occasional laughter sound like something earned rather than given freely. The way his hands moved when he talked about engines, describing mechanical problems with a fluency that bordered on poetry. One evening in mid-October, while we were cleaning up after dinner, Julian reached across me to put away a dish, and for a moment his body pressed against mine in the narrow space between counter and sink. The contact lasted only seconds, but I felt the warmth of his chest against my shoulder, caught the scent of soap and something else that was purely him. When he moved away, apologizing for the close quarters, I found myself wishing the kitchen were even smaller. Another night, as I was reaching for something on a high shelf, he appeared beside me, his hand brushing mine as he retrieved what I couldn't quite grasp. The gesture was so natural, so domestic, that we both paused afterward, looking at each other in the sudden awareness that we had crossed some invisible line in a territory that felt both dangerous and inevitable. We started taking walks after dinner, our steps slow and meandering through neighborhoods that looked different in the autumn light. Julian would smoke occasionally, offering me cigarettes that I accepted more for the ritual than the nicotine. The way we would pass them back and forth like communion, our fingers touching in the exchange. These walks took us past houses where other people's lives unfolded behind lit windows, and sometimes Julian would comment on what we observed with a wistfulness that suggested he was comparing their lives to his own. During one of these evening walks, he mentioned casually that Vanessa hadn't been calling much lately. The words were delivered without apparent weight, but I heard something underneath them. Not quite relief, but perhaps resignation. I didn't ask questions. By then I had learned that Julian would share what he was ready to share, and that pushing for more would only make him retreat into the careful politeness he used with people who didn't really know him. The house itself seemed to respond to our presence, settling into its bones with a contentment I hadn't felt since the early days of my marriage. The rooms felt warmer, though we hadn't adjusted the thermostat. The silence felt full rather than empty. Even the creaking floorboards sounded different. Not the complaints of a lonely house, but the satisfied sighs of walls that were finally being used as they were meant to be used. Neither of us spoke directly about what was happening between us. We were still two friends sharing space, still maintaining the careful boundaries that let us pretend this was temporary, practical, nothing more than mutual convenience. But something had shifted in the quality of our attention to each other, in the way we moved through the house like dancers learning the same choreography, in the way ordinary moments began to feel charged with possibility that neither of us was quite ready to name. November brought the kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there, and with it came a restlessness in Julian that I felt rather than saw. He would pace the living room some evenings after dinner, moving from window to bookshelf to kitchen doorway, like someone searching for something he couldn't name. His phone calls with Vanessa, which had already grown infrequent, became even more sporadic, brief, stilted conversations conducted in the privacy of the front porch or the guest room with the door carefully closed. I began waking earlier than usual, pulled from sleep by sounds I couldn't quite identify. Not disturbance exactly, but presence, the awareness that someone else in the house was also awake, also thinking thoughts too large for the darkness to contain. On a Tuesday night in mid-November, I woke to find the kitchen lights spilling down the hallway like a beacon. The digital clock beside my bed read 2:47, numbers that glowed with the harsh certainty of insomnia. I lay still for several minutes, listening to the house settle around whatever was keeping Julian awake, before finally giving in to the pull of that distant light. I found him sitting at the kitchen table, his head cradled in his hands, elbows resting on the scarred wood surface that had witnessed so many of our shared meals. A half-empty beer sat beside him, condensation pooling on the table in rings that caught the overhead light. He was still dressed in the jeans and flannel shirt he had worn to dinner, as if sleep had become impossible before he could even attempt it. He didn't notice me at first, lost in whatever private conversation he was having with the darkness beyond the kitchen window. When he finally looked up, his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying weight that was never meant to be borne alone. "I don't think she wants me back," he said quietly, the words emerging without preamble, as if we had already been talking about Vanessa for hours. The simplicity of the statement hit me with unexpected force, not because it was surprising, but because it was the first time either of us had acknowledged out loud what had been growing more obvious with each passing day. I moved to the refrigerator and retrieved a beer for myself, using the small ritual of opening it to buy time while I searched for the right response. There were things I could have said, reassurances about marriage being complicated, suggestions that maybe she just needed space, platitudes about working things out for Emma's sake. But sitting there in the harsh kitchen light, with Julian's vulnerability laid bare between us, such words felt inadequate and dishonest. Instead, I sat across from him at the table, in the chair that had become mine through months of shared dinners and quiet conversations. We didn't speak for a long while, letting the silence stretch between us like something that could hold weight. The refrigerator hummed. The house creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed through streets where other people's emergencies unfolded. Finally, without looking up from his beer, Julian spoke again. "I'm glad I'm here," he said. The words were so simple, so direct, that they lodged in my chest like something physical. Not grateful to be staying with me, not appreciative of my hospitality, but glad to be here, in this kitchen, in this moment, in whatever this thing between us was becoming. I wanted to tell him that I was glad too, that his presence had transformed my house from a place where I simply existed into somewhere that felt like home again. I wanted to say that the sound of his key in the lock had become the best part of my day, that I had started planning meals around his preferences without conscious thought, that I lay awake some nights listening to him move through the guest room and wondering what it would be like if he were moving through mine instead. But such admissions felt too large for the fragile moment we were sharing, too dangerous for the careful balance we had maintained. So I simply nodded, letting my silence carry whatever meaning he needed it to carry. Later that week, I was replacing a burned-out bulb in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and living room when Julian appeared beside me, offering to hold the stepladder steady. The space was cramped, designed for one person at a time, and as I reached up toward the light fixture, I became acutely aware of his proximity. He stood so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the lingering traces of motor oil and soap that had become as familiar to me as my own reflection. When I finished with the bulb and stepped down, we found ourselves inches apart in the confined space, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the small lines that appeared when he was thinking. Neither of us moved to create distance. For a moment that felt both eternal and impossibly brief, we simply stood there, breathing the same air, existing in the same impossible space. The awareness hit me, then, with the force of recognition. Not gradual understanding, but sudden, complete knowledge. I wanted him. Not just his company, not just his friendship, but him. The realization terrified me not because it was wrong, but because it felt so entirely right, so much like something I had been moving toward without knowing it. It was Julian who finally stepped back, who broke the spell with a small cough and a comment about the improved lighting. But as he moved away, I caught something in his expression, a flicker of awareness that suggested I wasn't alone in what I was feeling. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to him brush his teeth in the bathroom we now shared, I finally admitted to myself what I had been running from for weeks. In the quiet moments that filled our days, in the sound of his laughter echoing through rooms that had forgotten what joy sounded like, in the way morning light caught his profile as he read the newspaper, in the phantom warmth his presence left in spaces even after he had moved on, I had found something I hadn't known I was looking for. It terrified me, and yet it felt like relief. The call came on a Thursday evening in late November, when the first real cold snap had settled over the city and the windows of my house had begun to fog with the warmth of two people breathing in spaces meant for one. Julian's phone rang while we were cleaning up after dinner, the sharp electronic sound cutting through the comfortable quiet we had established as our evening rhythm. He glanced at the screen, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the kind of resignation that comes when you've been expecting something difficult and it finally arrives. "Vanessa," he said simply, showing me the name before answering, as if he needed a witness to whatever conversation was about to unfold. He took the call outside, stepping onto the front porch with the careful deliberation of someone preparing for surgery. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pace the narrow space between the porch railing and the front door, his free hand moving in gestures I couldn't interpret from this distance. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, though from inside the house it felt like hours. When he came back in, his face held the blank expression people wear when they're trying not to reveal how much something has cost them. He moved through the kitchen like someone navigating by memory rather than sight. Accepting the beer, I offered without seeming to register what it was. We sat at the table where we had shared so many meals, but tonight the familiar space felt charged with something that made ordinary conversation impossible. Julian stared at his hands wrapped around the beer bottle, his thumb tracing patterns in the condensation with mechanical precision. Finally, he spoke. "She wants me to come home," he said, the words emerging slowly, as if each one required individual consideration. "For Emma's sake," she says. "For the family." The phrase hit me like a physical blow, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. I had known this moment would come eventually, had been dreading it, actually, though I hadn't admitted as much to myself until I felt the sharp ache of impending loss settle in my chest. "And what do you want?" I asked, though part of me was terrified to hear the answer. Julian looked up at me then, and I saw confusion there, and something that might have been pain. "I don't know," he said. "I used to think I knew, but being here, living like this." He gestured vaguely at the kitchen around us, at the domestic tableau we had created without meaning to. It's made me question things I thought were settled. We sat in silence for a long while, the weight of unspoken possibilities pressing down on us like weather. I thought about Emma, about a 9-year-old girl who deserved a father present in her life rather than haunting it from a distance. I thought about Vanessa, about 12 years of marriage that might still be salvageable if Julian chose to salvage them. I thought about duty and responsibility and all the reasons why what I wanted didn't matter in the face of what was right. But I also thought about the way Julian moved through my house now, claiming space with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. I thought about morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, about evening walks that had become communion, about the way he had looked at me in the narrow hallway with something that felt like recognition. "You know, you don't have to go," I said quietly, the words emerging before I could stop them, before I could consider whether saying them would change everything between us irrevocably. Julian looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw the same battle I was fighting, between what felt right and what was right, between desire and duty, between the life he had built and the life that seemed to be building itself around us without our permission. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, a gesture so small it might have been imaginary. But I knew he had heard me, had understood what I was offering even if I couldn't name it explicitly. That night, neither of us slept well. I lay in my bed, listening to him move restlessly in the guest room, the sound of springs creaking under the weight of someone wrestling with decisions too large for comfort. Sometimes the movement would stop for long stretches, and I would find myself holding my breath, listening for signs of resolution that never came. Morning arrived gray and brittle, the kind of November day that makes you believe winter will last forever. I found Julian in the kitchen earlier than usual, already dressed for work, his duffel bag sitting by the front door like an accusation. We shared coffee in silence, the familiar ritual now feeling like something we were practicing for the last time. Neither of us mentioned the bag, though it dominated the room like an unwelcome guest demanding attention. When it was time for Julian to leave for work, we stood at the front door together, the threshold that had become so significant in our strange domestic dance. The bag sat between us, packed with the few possessions he had accumulated during his stay: shaving kit, spare clothes, the baseball cap that had found a home on my hall table. Julian reached out and rested his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that might have been goodbye or might have been something else entirely. His palm felt warm through the fabric of my shirt, and for a moment I was back in that narrow hallway, breathing the same air, existing in the same impossible space. The touch lingered just a second too long enough for me to understand that this wasn't just about Vanessa's call or Emma's needs or the practical requirements of marriage and family. This was about us, about whatever we had become during these months of careful distance and growing intimacy. When he finally stepped outside, I remained in the doorway, watching him load his bag into the truck that had become such a fixture in my driveway. He paused before getting in, looking back at the house, at me, with an expression I couldn't read. Then he was gone, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and the echo of possibilities that might never be explored. I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to my house settle back into the silence of one-person solitude, trying to convince myself that this was how it was supposed to end. But Julian's jacket still hung in the hallway, and some part of me refused to believe that goodbye could be so simple. Winter arrived with the kind of finality that makes you forget there was ever any other season. 3 weeks passed without word from Julian, 3 weeks that I measured not in days, but in the absence of familiar rituals. No coffee prepared for two, no evening conversations that stretched past sunset, no sound of another person moving through spaces that had learned to hold more than one life. I returned to the routines I had maintained before Julian's extended stay, though they felt different now, hollow in places where they had once felt sufficient. Coffee at 6:15, black and bitter in the mug that read World's Greatest Ad. The bus at 7:38, carrying me through neighborhoods where other people's lives continued to unfold behind lit windows. 8 hours bent over blueprints in an office that hummed with fluorescent efficiency, translating other people's dreams into the precise language of measurement and specification. But in the evenings, when I returned to a house that echoed with the memory of shared presence, I found myself setting 2 mugs on the counter before catching the mistake, before putting one away with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. The gesture became automatic, muscle memory refusing to accept what my mind knew to be true, That Julian had made his choice, had returned to the life that claimed him before I ever had the chance to understand what I was offering. His jacket still hung in the hallway where I had placed it that night when he didn't come, when I sat in the kitchen watching the door and waiting for a knock that never came. I told myself I kept it there for practical reasons. He would need it eventually, would have to return for this one piece of himself he had left behind. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than practicality. The jacket had become a talisman, proof that the months we had shared weren't something I had imagined in the desperate loneliness of a marriage that had ended before I was ready to let it go. December deepened around my solitude, bringing with it the kind of cold that made the house feel smaller, more contained. I found myself moving differently through rooms that had briefly held two people's dreams, stepping carefully around spaces where Julian's presence lingered like warmth from a fire that had burned out hours before. The guest room remained exactly as he had left it, bed made with military precision, the stack of architectural journals on the nightstand undisturbed by any evidence that someone had ever tried to sleep there. Some evenings I would stand in the doorway of that room, looking at the indentation his head had left in the pillow, wondering if he ever thought about the mornings we had shared coffee in comfortable silence, about the way domesticity had settled around us like something we had always known how to do together. I wondered if he remembered the evening walks that had become communion, the passing of cigarettes that felt like sacrament, the moment in the narrow hallway when we stood close enough to breathe the same air and almost close enough to call it what it was. On a Thursday evening in mid-December, as snow began to fall beyond the kitchen window, I found myself setting 2 mugs on the counter again, this automatic gesture of hope that persisted despite all evidence that it was no longer necessary. This time I didn't catch the mistake immediately. This time I stood there looking at both mugs, one filled with coffee that would grow cold, the other empty and waiting for someone who might never come to fill it. The snow fell steadily outside, covering the street where Julian's truck used to park, where Mrs. Chen's jasmine garden lay dormant under winter's patient grip. I thought about calling him, about driving across town to the house he shared with Vanessa and Emma, about standing on their front porch like some character from a movie who refuses to accept that love stories don't always end the way you want them to. But there are kinds of courage that look like restraint, kinds of love that express themselves through absence rather than presence. What Julian and I had discovered in those months of careful domesticity was real, but it existed in a space between his responsibilities and my solitude, in the margin between what was possible and what was right. To pursue it further would be to destroy the very thing that made it precious, its tenderness, its uncertainty, its respect for the complexity of lives that belong to more people than just ourselves. I poured the extra coffee down the sink and washed both mugs, putting them away in the cabinet where they would wait for some future occasion that might never come. The gesture felt like acceptance, though I wasn't sure what exactly I was accepting, his absence, perhaps, or the possibility that some kinds of love are meant to be held lightly, like snow that melts when you try to grasp it too tightly. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table with the jacket folded neatly beside me, my gaze drifting toward the door that stood firmly closed against the winter night. I was not waiting, not exactly, but the part of me that had awakened during those months of shared meals and quiet conversations had not gone back to sleep. It remained alert, patient, like something that understood the difference between endings and pauses, between doors that close forever and doors that simply wait for the right season to open again. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, marking another day in a life that had learned to hold both presence and absence with equal grace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in the kind of silence that makes everything possible, even the things we're not brave enough to name. In the morning, there would be coffee for one, and the day would unfold with the measured precision I had perfected over years of living alone. But tonight, in this moment suspended between what was and what might yet be, I sat with Julian's jacket and listened to the snow, and found that solitude could hold hope just as surely as it could hold loneliness. Some stories end with resolution. Others end with the quiet understanding that the most important parts of ourselves are often found in the spaces between certainty and desire, in the courage to love without demanding possession, in the wisdom to know when holding on means letting go.